Welcome back, everyone. It's day 2 of Wings Up Week and another day of armchair flying online. It's not quite the same, but we're going to make the best of it. We had a very fun show yesterday with Brian Turner, Josh Flowers, and Spencer Sutterman, and it's a clash of the YouTubers, but those guys are crazy funny, and it's pretty obvious why they have so many fans. And by the way, if you ever see Spencer, make sure to pronounce his name Sutterman. He kind of likes that. He'll love it. For today, as Monty Python would have put it, now for something completely different. Today's Flight Sim Day. And I'm not talking about using a Redbird or a Frasca to practice instrument approaches. That's too obvious. Everybody's done that. Today we're going to drill down into it from a different perspective. Using home simulators such as X-Plane and Microsoft Flight Sim, we're going to use these as motivators and morale boosters while we're all stuck in the house. I started playing with Flight Sim back in the very early days, before it was a Microsoft product. It was written by a guy named Bruce Artwick. His company was Sublogic, and it was a pretty mind-blowing piece of software at that time. Initially, there were wireframe monochrome graphics, but personal computers were still brand new, and it was totally amazing and immersive for the time. Maybe I was more easily amused back then, but for a perspective, look at these 3 screenshots. Going left to right, you can see how the graphics slowly evolved over the first 10 years. Even in these crude early versions, the programming was extremely sophisticated, allowing the user to navigate within a 3D virtual airspace. Now, looking at current flight sims like X-Plane and Microsoft Flight Sim, we see computer flying brought up to visual reality. The only things that they're missing now are the G's. To help us examine these products, I've enlisted a couple of experts, one from Florida and one from Alaska, and you probably know them both. Meet Paul Duty of Gleim and Chris Palmer of Angle of Attack. Welcome, guys. And Paul, let me get started with you first. You're down there in Florida today. We would have been there with you at Sun and Fun in the Hangar C. What's the weather like down there today?
I tell you what, we had a cold front go through last night. It's only about 75 degrees today, so I don't know. I almost had to put on a sweatshirt this morning.
That sounds absolutely awful. I'm so glad I'm not down there. Well, anyway, we're going to be talking about your product that you integrate with X-Plane. But let me go over and say hello now to Chris, who had quite an exciting week last week. He was in California visiting with friends, and he ended up having to get himself back to Alaska during a period when the flights weren't so easily available. So Chris, kind of walk us through what happened to you last week.
Yeah, I was actually down there for several months visiting family and actually just kind of getting out of Alaska for the winter. Wanting to get some sunshine. I actually got some color on my skin for once. Usually I'm fairly pasty, but now I'm got a little tan, so doing pretty good there. And the eventual plan was to go from California onto Sun and Fun, do some flying around Florida, then go to Texas and fly with Josh, who I know you had on yesterday. But obviously, as things started to change in the world, our family decided that we needed to make our way back to Alaska. And I've kind of been thinking about this entire process we've been going through as risk management. And as a pilot, I feel like I'm pretty good at risk management. So I saw going on an airline as an actual risk that we're taking a calculated risk. So we decided to do that while we were on the flight. A health mandate went into effect in Alaska where we had to be quarantined for 14 days. So we're halfway through that quarantine now. And they tested us when we got there. They took our temperature, asked us a bunch of questions, made us sign a document that we would be at our place of quarantine. If they caught us not at our place of quarantine, $25,000 or up to a year in prison. So they're taking it very seriously. But the kids did great. They slept most of the flight. They both had a row to sleep, and we're safe. And I'm back at work now, so it's going pretty good, all things considered.
Yikes. Yikes, $25,000. They were serious about that, huh?
Oh, yeah. Yep, very much so.
That's not a quarantine you want to be breaking. Did you have any trouble getting your flights hooked up to get from California? You didn't? Because I know at one point you were concerned.
Well, it was more the fluidity of the situation from day to day. I wasn't sure if they would cancel our flight last second or if they would close all domestic travel or close off California because it was presenting itself as a hot spot. They've actually done pretty well overall, even until now. But yeah, we went there and hardly anyone at the airport. It was kind of eerie, but we made it out, and now we're gonna hunker down for a while and try to do good, useful things with our time, like this live stream.
Okay, excellent. Well, you're back in beautiful Homer, am I correct?
I am. Yep. It's been beautiful for a few days. Today it's snowing, so I'm happy to be inside for the moment. But yeah, we're back and waiting for spring now.
Okay, good deal. I'm back. I'm glad you're back home, and I hope this 14 days travels goes by fast for you. Unfortunately, like the rest of us, you may end up stuck in your house anyway. Well, let's get back with Paul. And Paul, let's go over your. Tell us about this product that Gleim has, where you integrate flight training, real flight training, using X-Plane's flight simulator.
Right, yeah. So a lot of folks say that the airplane isn't really the best classroom. I like the airplane myself. I obviously love to fly. Who doesn't? But in terms of preparing for your flight training, there really isn't a better way to prepare for your flight training than to hop in a simulator, whether it's something that you have at home. Doesn't necessarily have to be an elite, setup. Doesn't have to have, all the bells and whistles. The setup that I'm in behind me here is the Gleim virtual cockpit. It's just running off of X-Plane. It's the same X-Plane that you can run on your home computer from one screen. But yeah, so we created the X-Plane flight training course. It's based on our private pilot syllabus. So every single lesson that's in the flight part of the syllabus is integrated there with X-Plane. So you've got a virtual instructor, a series of training videos, over 1,000 checkpoints that you go through in the course, and it walks you through everything from the four fundamentals of flight all the way through your cross countries and stage checks, and gives you a real-time instruction, feedback, post-flight reports. It's a really, really cool system and a really cool way to prepare for your flight training.
Okay, good. And you're a product manager there at Gleim, correct?
I am, yeah, product manager, and then we also have a 141 on rounds, the chief instructor for that as well.
Okay, well, in a minute, let's come back and dig more deeply into the product here and take a look at it. But let me punch back over to Chris. And Chris, do you have any, I know years ago you were doing a lot of flight sim videos on YouTube. Have you integrated that in any practical way with your own flight students?
I think the best way in a regular world from day to day to use a simulator is still with instrument. It makes a lot of sense to use a simulator for instrument, particularly when we're talking about a pilot that is at home with time on their hands, wanting to practice and repeat those procedures and checklists and everything that comes along with instrument from the comfort of their own home, so that they can take that back to the airplane and have good proficiency. It is, I am a huge proponent of it. I went from being a hobbyist flight simmer back in the day as a teenager to becoming a pilot, eventually an instructor. And so I'm a huge proponent of having a simulator, especially for personal use, because it's free time. I mean, with the fidelity of the simulators today, it's free time that you can spend doing very high quality repetition with your own simulator. And I mean, we're even talking about now, you can have something like FlightChops right along with that as a tool that you would use in your everyday flying anyway. It's right there and synced up and working perfectly. So yep, I'm all in. I'm a huge supporter of simulation. I think it's a good time for people to learn about it right now, because it's been around for a long time, but it deserves more attention from the pilot community for sure.
Absolutely. And this question comes up in the forums and the Facebook groups and all forever. This is one of these high wing versus low wing questions. It's just going to come to us forever. Or is a simulator really useful at somebody in the primary stage, at a private pilot student? And like you mentioned, sim, especially if you use something like an Elite or a Frasca or a Redbird, great for doing instrument work, but not very practical for a primary student trying to polish up their landings. You might be able to pre-fly cross-country flights on the sim, and that might be good, but primarily the simulator is best served for instrument training. And that's when I do instrument training with students, we spend at least 5 hours in an Elite flight sim before we ever touch the airplane. But today we're not going to get bogged down into training oriented stuff. We're going to try to look at simulators on how we can use them to help pass the time during the next weeks and months. So Paul, let's go back to you and tell us about your product.
Sure. So, kind of to touch on what you just said there about simulators being used for instrument versus private pilot training, um, I got my start with using the Microsoft in the 90s. So, when I was a teenager, I started a virtual airline. At one point, had about 3,000 pilots in that all over the world flying these routes. And it was a lot of fun, but that was my introduction to aviation. When I went to flight school and I learned to fly in 2000 is when I got I would look at my school syllabus and I would go home and I would fly that lesson, whatever my next lesson was. I set it up as if I was my own instructor. It was wonderful. So every time I would go to the airplane and fly with my instructor, he would want to know who I was flying with, opposed to him. And I checked my logbook. I'm not flying with anybody else. I didn't tell him I was using the Microsoft Flight Simulator. I set up the lessons and did every single one of my ratings at the FAA minimum times. And then I've always pushed that with students. After my private pilot, I told my instructor what I was doing. And I mean, he was just absolutely blown away at how powerful it was and how closely we could relate a home simulator like Microsoft Flight Sim to what I was actually doing in the airplane. So what we've done here then at Gleim is we've taken some of those principles and we've put them into this training course. And a lot of folks don't necessarily know what to do once you get a simulator. It's kind of like, if you get an airplane, if you get in an airplane and somebody hands you the keys and you have no experience, what are you going to do? Where are you going to go? If you don't have an instructor there to help you out, what's next? So that's kind of where a lot of folks are with flight simulation. It's a sandbox game. How do you use it effectively? A lot of folks want to say that you're going to develop bad habits. Well, you can prevent bad habits if you use the tool properly, and if you really apply some good sound principles and treat it like a training tool.
Okay, and we've had a couple of comments here in the chat box. Jed said he's a big fan, but he totally disagrees, and he thinks the sims are even more useful during private pilot. So there's another, perspective, and clearly, Paul, you're making that argument. So you've had a lot more of experience at it. Let's. I know you've got a bundle, a free bundle. I think we've got a graphic for this to tell people where to go. But let's dig now. You want to go ahead and take a look at the parts of the sim and actually see how it's done using your product. And for all of you watching, there was the the URL. I think it was Gleim Aviation /wings up. Would you like to just go through it piece by piece now?
Yeah, sure. I think the most important thing is, yeah, I think one of the most important things is when you go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Russ.
Yeah, we're getting into one of these latency things. Yeah, let's just go through it a little bit and then jump back out to me. We can discuss and then we'll continue on.
Good deal. So I think one of the most important things is setting up your simulator as realistically as possible. And there's some pretty easy ways to do that, and you don't spend a ton of money. You don't have to spend thousands of dollars. Once you get the software loaded up, try to set up your flight controls like your airplane. Yeah, you can fly with a mouse, but that's not very realistic. We don't like to have mice in the cockpit because, well, they eat the wires. If you at least get a really simple joystick, something like this is just a simple Logitech joystick. They're about $40. So you can have your pitch, you can have your roll. It has a built-in throttle to it. It's a pretty cheap, pretty inexpensive way to get started and have a flight control in your hand. You can also rotate it, which would operate the rudders, or in some simulators, if you don't have a rudder control, it'll automatically coordinate the rudder for you. If you wanted to upgrade, you could get a yoke, get some type of a flight yoke. That way you can replicate your airplane. If your plane has a yoke, we recommend you fly with a yoke. Same thing with a throttle. So get a throttle quadrant, mixture prop throttle. if your plane doesn't have the prop control, if you're flying a 172 or a Cherokee, that's fine. You just won't use that lever on there. If you're flying a multi-engine airplane, the great thing about these is that you can bundle them up. Point is that there's a lot of different hardware options out there, and then we're even starting to get into virtual reality. So this is the Oculus X plane is fully integrated with virtual reality. It's amazing the way that you can immerse yourself into flight simulation. I mean, and really feel like you're in the cockpit. You mentioned the program. The one thing that's missing with the simulators is you don't have the G's. I tell you what, sometimes G forces can make you motion sick, but this virtual reality, if you're not careful, you'll get motion sick there too. But yeah, the hardware is pretty important. Having those controls so that you can fly it just like you would in the real airplane, that's where you got to start.
I got you. So having the Oculus or something like that is perfectly capable of making you airsick under the right circumstances, huh?
It totally will, yeah.
Okay. Chris, do you have any comments about how people, what kind of hardware they can use to kind of get into flight simming without spending a lot of money and breaking the bank? Any suggestions?
Yeah, I think starting simple, and Paul has some great tips there in terms of making it as realistic as you possibly can. You can get a little crazy and out in the weeds with a lot of these available hardware options and panels, and you can really get lost in that. You can spend way more money on flight sim gear than you could on a private pilot license. So I think you got to be careful and practical. But even something like a yoke, throttle quadrant, and pedals is plenty good for a lot of the work that you can do, because really on the virtual side of things, you really don't need instruments because those can be just in the 3D environment. And as long as you have the tactile tools of how you usually control an airplane, can really help the muscle memory start to take place, or even if you're just keeping up with those skills as we go along here. And I wanted to piggyback off of what I said earlier, and also bring in Paul's comments and the person that commented there on the live stream, in that a simulator is really good for instrument training. I think almost every instrument pilot that wants to remain proficient should have some sort of home simulator option. But right now, with everyone staying at home and being on lockdown, being kicked out of flight training temporarily, all bets are off. And I think we've got to get really creative about how we use things like a simulator, even for primary instruction. And the way that Paul's story kind of came in with him using a simulator and doing the lessons that he had from his flight school is a fantastic example of that, where if you use the real tools and the real training material, and then use the simulator as a tool as well, it can really help you make this a boon in your flight training rather than a setback. So I would just encourage people to think outside the box right now. And this is a good way to stay in the game. And I just want to wrap all that together, because I really am a proponent of simulators, even at the VFR level. And even back to Paul, the VR headset now is amazing when you put it on and you actually go to land. Usually when you land in a simulator, the sensations of a 2D screen, you just don't get it. But with a VR headset, you can actually judge the height above the ground to get in ground effect and have a really nice landing. So it's pretty amazing.
And a good thing for people if they're home and you don't have any simulators on your computer at the moment, these days of buying these things on DVDs or CDs is gone. You download these things right off the internet, X-Plane or Microsoft Flight Sim, I assume. Again, we've got the product from Gleim, and we'll put that graphic back up again and just leave it up there for a second so people can get that URL for Gleim's product. So realize that if you have a strong enough machine, if you've got a good strong computer, you can download these things right now at home and you can get them running. Hopefully you maybe have a joystick around the house. In a very worst case, you can fly with a mouse, but you have the opportunity now, even if you're stuck at home. And you can always get out on Amazon, and they're still delivering stuff around the country, and for not much money at all, order yourself a joystick, download a sim, and get in there and start flying with it and kind of get used to it. Uh, Now, I'd like for both Paul and Chris to talk about what kind of reasonable horsepower does somebody need to have to get some type of reasonable fun out of it. I know as you start to turn up realism and scenery and all this stuff, it gobbles up CPU cycles really fast. Do either one of you guys have anything? Paul?
Yeah, I don't have the specific number on me. I think one of the most important things though is making sure that you have a dedicated graphics card. A lot of computers have a an integrated graphics card. If you go to your local big box store and you buy a computer, there it might not have dedicated graphics. In that case, the CPU is doing all of the work, not just powering the processes of the system, but also powering all the visuals as well. So when you have a dedicated video card, it makes a huge difference. If you when you go if you go to that URL where we're giving away X-Plane for a couple of months, you can see the system specifications. But once you're in it, there's quite a few things that you can do to adjust the scenery. Of course, a lot of folks like to crank up the scenery and see breeze as you can. I'll be honest with you, when I'm flying my sim, especially if I'm using it for training, I'm up high. I'm not flying in what we call the wire environment. I'm not flying down low. So I don't care if I have all the buildings and all the trees. I want to be able to see my instrument panel. I want to be able to set up the equipment, set up the automation. I want to get used to my fluids inside the cockpit there. I don't really care what my outside scenery looks like as long as I've got somewhere to fly.
Okay, Chris, do you have anything to add on to that? And also, Chris, take a moment and let's mention your website, not your website necessarily, but your YouTube channel. I know you've got a lot of subscribers on that, and you do have some flight sim material on that too. So, any comments on hardware or on your YouTube channel?
Yeah, Paul is accurate in what he says. I mean, graphics cards are kind of where things are powered these days. And if you're looking at something that's off the shelf, say it's already an inclusive kit, a desktop, you're going to want to look more in the gaming side of the market than, say, the workstation. That's going to be your keyword is gaming. You can get a fairly high quality, low grade. That's an oxymoron, but low cost, rather high quality, low cost option that can run the simulator just fine without the ability to crank up the sliders, as we call it. But really, what you want in a simulator is you do want the visuals, you want that amount of realism, but there's a balance because really you can get really expensive on these machines. As we know, computers can get quite expensive as the power goes up. But what you want is the responsiveness. So while you can slide those sliders up, it'll ruin your frame rate and it won't feel realistic anymore. It'll be choppy. So you got to keep it down, keep it fluid. And so it feels more like flying a real plane. But yeah, looking for an off-the-shelf gaming laptop or desktop might be more something that people can look at right away to just get the job done. And then in terms of my my YouTube, yeah, you can go to Angle of Attack on YouTube. I did a recent video where I set up a simulator in my office, and it's pretty nice. It did cost around the $2,000 to $3,000 range. So I have the flight controls, a very nice computer, a 4K monitor. I'm using this for work as well, so I went a little bit above and beyond. But that's a really good tool. And actually, we did a creative thing with the instrument panel in that we use an iPad app that connects to to X-Plane and will show you in very fluid motion the 6-pack instruments that you have. You can customize those as well to different types of instruments, but it's a very good tool. And my advice would be for people out there that want to get into this quickly is keep it simple. Find a simple gaming laptop to use, get the simple controls, go to Gleim and download X-Plane and really start to integrate your training into this. And especially those things that maybe you're not so good at right now, procedures, checklists, emergency procedures, those things you could use work on. It might not be so good for things like, judging height on a landing or doing particular maneuvers, but we're 90% there with a simulator. So it is very, very useful.
Okay, we've got a lot of people commenting in this chat box here. I'm only looking at one of these, so we may have people, I know we do have people on YouTube and Facebook, and I apologize I don't have them up, but we've got Jed, Pamela, Emily, Ethan, Patrick, Nick, Rex. Thank you all. And a number of people have asked, how much do they expect to spend on a reasonable rig? And I know that everything, there's no limit to that. We got the address for the Gleim offer. That was Gleim Aviation / Wings Up. And then Rares, forgive me if I mispronounced the name, says it's difficult to look around in a sim, but when practicing touch and goes. And yes, that is a problem if you have a very simple joystick. Now they have some that's got a little hat switch on the top, and using that, you can actually program it so that it changes your view. So that you flick it to the left, you look to the left, flick it to the right, flick up here, flick up here. So there are some options on programmable joysticks, which will take care of that. Let's move on though, guys, to talk about some challenges that people might work on. Now, Chris, I think you have worked with Pilot Edge quite a bit in the past, and this is where people can actually do instrument approaches with a real controller, and there's other people in the virtual airspace. Can you kind of give us a little overview on how online ATC services work?
Yeah, Pilot Edge came about a handful of years ago and adds that professional layer to the ATC communication. So if you're having difficulty with radio calls, whether it's in VFR flying or IFR flying, particularly in IFR flying, this helps a lot of people out. But across the board, you essentially go to an area where Pilot Edge covers, because they can't cover the entire world. They do cover Southern California. I think there might be another area they cover. And when you call up a frequency, you literally just dial it in, look it up on ForeFlight, find out what the ground frequency is, and call that up. And you will get a response from the controller on that frequency. And then you can go about your communications as normal. It's completely transparent to you. You just do things as they are in the real world, and you get the real world instructions within the confines of a simulator. So this is something that is used from everyone, like at the home flight sim level, all the way up to level D simulators that are using this service as well. So it's very high quality. All those people are playing in the same sandbox, and it works out really well. And it's a great way to learn communications and stay sharp on them as well.
Okay, is X-Plane one of your simulators of choice, Chris? And if it is, we got a little quick X-Plane video we can run as you talk about it.
Yeah, it certainly is. And the thing I really like about X-Plane is it works outside the box really well. You don't need a bunch of add-on scenery, add-on airplanes. You load it up, you get your settings right, and you've got the GPS, you've got the instruments, you've got a 172, you've got a variety of different airplanes you can use, and it just works outside the box or out of the box really well. Whereas with Microsoft Flight Simulator, at least the old one, there is a new one coming out that's not quite out yet, but the old one takes quite a few third-party add-ons to really get it to the quality level of X-Plane. X-Plane, you can add things on as well. If you want your particular aircraft that you're using, you can download third-party software for that airplane. I know one place to get that is Aviation. They do those aftermarket airplanes you can put into the simulator. So I just like it because it works right outside the box, and I don't like to fiddle with simulators anymore. I like to get in there and work. And I think that's where most people are going to be. They just want to get in there and start flying right away and utilize this time that we have.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was surfing around the internet because we get the professional version of X-Plane that we use for some of our animations, although most of the animations we do are in-house. But while rummaging around through available models, we actually found somebody had modeled and painted up the Gold Seal DC-3. So we were able to get our DC-3 that was already painted up and everything, just as an add-on third-party model that we could drop right in and use. Now, we mentioned that one thing we wanted to do today was come up with some challenges, some things that people could do with a flight simulator during this period to help pass the time. One of the first things that came to my mind was doing a real-time cross-country. A lot of us have thought about, well, what would it be like to take my 150 or my 172 and fly from California to North Carolina? Well, here's your chance. It doesn't cost anything in avgas either. So maybe people could consider putting together some flights for destinations that are far and wide. I mean, it's, well, something like a 172, it's going to take you 2 or 3 or 4 days to make a cross-country flight anyway. So just go ahead and fly it in real time in your home. Do 2 or 3 hours, stop, fly another hour or two, get gas, go to bed in your own hotel room, and then pick it up the next day. Do you guys have any other suggestions on some other ones that people might give a try to help pass the time and keep their heads in aviation?
Yeah, I'll take that. So, good suggestion there as far as doing a mock cross country. When you do that, go through the go through the process of planning a flight the same way that you would in real life. So, if you've gone through that, I think one of the coolest things is that you can set the weather any way that you want. You can also download the real world weather and integrate that into X-Plane. So you can actually call flight service, or you can go on to whatever your favorite app is to get a weather briefing, and whatever the weather is outside, your simulator can do that. At X-Plane, it's just a simple setting there, and it'll run it with the same weather conditions that you have outside. And then you have to plan the flight, including crosswind corrections and fuel planning. That's the thing too, is you can't, if you want to fly the whole way across the country, you can't just go to an altitude and set the autopilot and then go to bed and get up the next morning. You'll wake up and the plane will crash. It will run out of its virtual gas. Luckily, you don't have to pay for it, so stop when you need to and fill up the tanks. But yeah, it'll run out of gas. Some other unique things that you can do, that you can simulate, is high altitude. So you want to know what the effects of something like hypoxia and altitude sickness are. Take that simulator up 14, 15, 16,000 feet, and you'll actually start to see screen start to turn black. And we've actually taken tech support calls, and they'll say, "Hey, I'm flying along, and all of a sudden my screen just turns black." Well, the first question we ask them was, "What altitude were you at?" And if they tell us that they are over 14 or 15,000 feet, we say, "Well, that's because you're suffering from hypoxia. You're losing your vision. If you're in one of the pressure planes, if you don't set up your pressurization in the cabin, you're going to suffer virtually from hypoxia." So it will fly it just like it will in the real plane. So do set up your flights just like you would in the real world, and then enjoy the flight.
Yeah, tomorrow David St. George is going to be on with us again. He's one of the hosts of this. He with Safe. One of the things he's going to discuss tomorrow is a cross-country flight he just did about 10 days ago from Oregon back to New York in an RV-12. It was all VFR. He got stuck up in Montana in snowstorms and everything, and was having to go from one airport to the next. So it's a pretty exciting little flight he had. He's going to go over that tomorrow, but that's the type of flight perhaps you could go ahead and make a really challenging one like that, the type of flight you could do in your own simulator. Now, I thought of another one. How about a real-time transatlantic flight? Go take the route up over Nova Scotia, Greenland, to Iceland, to Ireland. These are things you got plenty of time. We're going to be sitting in our homes for weeks, perhaps longer. Got plenty of time to really find some challenges like this. Another one that I had in mind, and I wrote down a few here, pilotage and dead reckoning. Give yourself a cross country, but forget the GPS. Just do it by landmarks on the ground. Try to pick, bodies of water or good solid landmarks that are hard to find but close enough so you can go stepping stone from one to the next. And that's a good chance to let you polish up and refresh yourself on some of these most basic of aviation concepts. Got another one. Google Earth and Google Maps. I would suggest people, if you're going to try one of these transatlantic flights or one of these cross-continental flights, go ahead and look at some of the areas, take advantage of some of the options we have online to refresh ourselves, just as the FARs tell us to, about everything involving the flight. Get a look at the airports in advance. Now I've got one more. Fly VFR 8,500 feet over a reasonably populated area of the country. Fly for 30 minutes in some random direction. Don't plan this at all. 8,500 feet, and suddenly just stop your engine. Now you haven't already planned whether or not you've got an airport within gliding distance. See if you make it. Put yourself in this situation that might happen in real life. Just when you're flying along, just say, now's the time. Pull the engine, see if you make it back to the airport or a good landing spot, and that's a good use of your time too. Well, Paul and Chris, I want to thank both you guys for being here. We could stay here for another 30 minutes, but we got guys sitting back in the green room who are getting bored, so we got to get them on here too. But thanks very much for joining us today. Visit Paul at Gleim Aviation. Is it gleimaviation.com? Is that correct?
Yes, you got it.
Okay. And Chris at angleofattack.com. Chris is a flight instructor. He's got flight instruction products online as well as his YouTube channel, which is very popular. So thanks again, guys. Really had a lot of fun. We'll be talking soon.
Thanks, Russ.
Appreciate
Next
it, Russ.
on the agenda.
Good job putting this on.
My pleasure. Thank you. All right, next on the agenda, we've got our next guest is somebody that you're going to know from YouTube. Everybody knows him. But before we get there, we talked about yesterday that one of the reasons we were putting this on this particular week and every day is kind of as a replacement for Sun and Fun. We were all planning on meeting down there. I was looking forward to seeing some people, and you probably were too. And that's why we brought these people online so that we could talk to them and get to hear from them virtually anyway. Now, had we been at Sun and Fun, we had t-shirts and all sorts of things to give away. And one of the things, we printed up a bunch of flyers. These flyers had a promo code on it, especially for Sun and Fun. And that promo code is SNF20, SNF20. We were going to give these away to everybody who came by the booth, save $20 on an enrollment at our groundschool.com product. Instructors can join for free, so they don't even need a code. But what we did, because of the circumstances, we want to help keep everybody involved in aviation and introduce them to Gold Seal. We doubled the value of the discount code. So that SNF20 will now save you $40 on an enrollment at groundschool.com. All right, our next guy who definitely would have been at Sun and Fun, we see him there every year, and he's always a hoot to talk to. Mr. Chops, Steve Thorne. Steve, are you fall asleep in the green room, or are you with us?
No, it was cool to hear those guys talking about this stuff because they're sim experts. I'm a sim newbie. But to be clear, I was supposed to be at Aero Friedrichshafen this year. I was going to skip Sun and Fun and be in Europe. So I had a whole lot of juggling to cancel lots of travel plans. My family was coming with me. So yeah, I'm in it with everybody else, just dealing with damage control and repercussions of all the cancellations. But yeah, there's my sim there that I've got time to use now because I'm not going anywhere.
Yeah. And you were planning on, once you were in Germany, you were going to go into Africa, weren't you?
Well, we were going to come home first, but we had a trip to Africa in May. That was all booked. So that also has completely been canceled, obviously. Yeah, it's been a frustrating time.
Well, very sad story. I'm
first.
Yep. All right, well, we'll talk about more fun things today. Let me get my papers here straightened out here. So you're known primarily as an influencer in the aviation community, and your YouTube channel in particular, I think, is one of the things that's really brought you to the front of the community. So Steve's YouTube channel is called FlightChops. What's the exact, is it YouTube/FlightChops, Steve?
Yeah, you just search FlightChops, that'll get you there. So FlightChops on YouTube,
that's true. So
FlightChops.com is the website. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the whole thing is kind of an
Something
accident, to be
so,
honest. I didn't really ever intend to be an influencer. I don't know how much I love that word, but I mean, at the end of the day, I'm just another pilot, just wants to get better, and sharing my learning process as a weekend warrior kind of evolved into all sorts of type ratings and checkouts and different types and so on. And I mean, you were cool enough to set me up with the experience in the DC-3. So the things that the channel has allowed me to do and share has been, never could have imagined where I would get with it. So it's very community driven, and it's not about me. I try real hard to make it about sharing, putting people in the seat, and very authentically and vulnerably showing the learning process. I don't have a lot of total time. I've just been lucky to fly a lot of types and share it. Yeah, there's the T6 Harvard. That's probably the biggest achievement that I've ever pulled off. I really didn't think I'd get access to an airplane like that. So being able to now call myself a T6 pilot is definitely something I could not have imagined would have been possible. But it's just, the community is so great, and I'm proud to be a part of it and I'd rather call myself an ambassador, I think, for aviation, and just sort of share the passion and inspire people to try something new. Like, even if you fly a 172 or a Bonanza or whatever, go get your tailwheel endorsement, go get a float rating, go go get a multi-engine rating, even if you don't think you're going to need it. Just do it just to sharpen your skills and understand what's going on with the complexity side, and it'll make you better in everything else you're doing.
Well, ambassador, I think, is actually a very good word for what you do. I mean, you really do a good service for the community with your videos, because you have worked your way, you've worked hard to get to check out in a lot of different airplanes and fly in a lot of different situations, take different types of training. So it's excellent that you're able to pass this on to the community through the value of YouTube. So I do like ambassador as a term. You've got a unique knack, a talent, and we're gonna be talking about this again with you on Friday. How to tell a story in video. We're not going to get into that now, but I've always admired how you know how to edit video and to tell a story and to make information transfer from one person to the next. So good on that. Let's go into our real topic though for today, which is flight simulators. Now you were actually a tester for the pre-beta version. I guess I would call that the alpha version of Microsoft Flight Simulator, the current one that's not out yet. Is that correct?
Yeah, they invited a bunch of us down to a launch event and kind of had us on our NDA and secret. We couldn't even talk about where we were going. It was really secret. That was, I guess, back in September, I want to say. I can't even remember exactly when it was, but it was interesting to get access to the developers. And as a pilot, that's not really a sim guy per se. I mean, I played with sims in the early days, but I wouldn't say I touched sims much in the past 5 years before this. So to see where it is at now, that product is what's unique. Yeah, so they're playing some footage here of it. It's not supporting IFR yet, as far as what I got to see. I'm sure they're working on that. I can't imagine they're going to release it without some sort of IFR support. But what it does amazingly, as you can see by this footage, is the VFR. It's not just scenery like we're used to seeing, which is rendered based on someone having kind of told it there's a building here and modeling things and so on. It's actually based on real data. They talk about 2 petabytes of data coming from Bing mapping software. So it's literally based on real world data, which is then procedurally generated, I think is the word. And it uses satellite imagery combined with
Okay, we may have had lost a signal there. There we go.
No.
He's back. Steve,
How much did you lose me?
we lost you there. Continue.
Okay. I don't know where you lost me. Just let me know the last thing you heard me say.
Well, you were basically talking about how they had essentially bitmapped the Earth rather than using textures and stuff to generally make buildings and ground, and how they had taken more of a real world approach and just bitmapped the planet.
Right.
The scenery is just amazing on that.
So it's because it's not rendered based on someone modeling it, if you know what I mean. They actually are using, they've got 2 petabytes of data coming from Bing. That's real satellite imagery combined with mapping information. And like they told us to go fly in our neighborhood. All of us, we're people from literally all over the world. They had people from Europe and all kinds of different places. So I went and launched and flew over Toronto, and there's a windmill, a single windmill near the island airport that's kind of off one of the approaches there, and it's got 3 blades like you're used to seeing. I expected that not to be there. I was like, that won't be there. That's just too specific. And it was there. So something, and there's no way some guy modeled a windmill off the threshold of runway 08 in Toronto. Like it just can't be, right? So it was based on, I guess the satellite knows what a windmill looks like from the top down or something, and it combined it with some other information that they had from mapping data, and it was put there by the system quite accurately. So we could fly into our neighborhood and literally find our house because it's accurately working it out based on the satellite imagery. So the VFR flying is like nothing I've ever seen before. And they also are basing the weather. They're not sprites in 2D, whatever, the cloud things that have been used to create illusions of clouds. They're doing it based on weather data and particles and so on. So like really the rain and the meteorological effects were quite impressive. And they also had thermals and so on pretty well modeled, which I don't quite understand how they're doing it, but I guess it knows what a cumulus cloud is, so it understands the thermal there. So you could try to fly into one and feel the thermal would be about where it should be. And it was really amazing to see how well they did that side of it.
So overall, what do you think? And I can't see them releasing this product without full IFR support. I mean, Microsoft is not the type of company who's going to put out a product that's only halfway there. So assuming that it's got everything you would expect along the lines of IFR and everything else, what do you think? Have they got something pretty special?
Yeah, they're definitely raising the bar on a lot of levels. Having said that, I mean, I'm using X-Plane 11 for IFR stuff, and it's been everything I want it to be. So trying to think like, what do I want out of a flight sim? The flight model they talked about, I think most simulators use a single point on the model of the airplane to kind of, pull it or push it or whatever, and then they kind of fake the idea of if it stalls and a wing drops. They're talking about 2,000 data points on the airframe of their model. So you can literally stall the wing the way it stalls when the airflow kind of detaches. And I tested that stuff, and it was interesting. I was trying to spin it, and it kept on only spinning left, which I guess that makes sense if there's power. So I pulled the power, I even shut the engine down, and it kept on wanting to spin left. So I thought, is this a problem? And then I talked to one of the developers, and he said, well, we've got it modeled assuming you're solo, so it's putting your weight in the left seat, so it's biasing towards the left. So I was like, all right, that's pretty advanced. I did manage to get it to spin right, but it was harder in a 172. But it spun like no simulator I've ever seen spin. Like, it really was quite real. I held the control inputs in, it spun properly, and then I recovered, and it felt like the right kind of recovery. I've never had a simulator do that where it felt real. So that was impressive. But again, going back to what do we use sims for? Hand flying, I don't know how much value there is there. The controls become the problem, and that was the problem actually. My biggest complaint was they set us up with a standard yoke, the same one I've got here. Actually, this sort of springy Logitech one, it's got such a lack of feel. I know there's a new one, the Honeycomb has just come out. I think people are talking about that as being game changing. So to me, the problem with sims at home is the control feedback input. Until they get that figured out, I don't care how good they look. They're not gonna make it easy to learn how to hand fly at all.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about with the springy yokes. We have an Elite setup, and it's still, even though it's somewhat expensive, it's still got springs in there. And when you find yourself having to fly with the trim wheel, which is not really what you want to do, because instead of releasing the pressure and trimming to stay there, you have to do it backwards. I went up to see Rudy Frasca and his son some number of years back, and we talked about that problem, and they actually have theirs, and I'm sure other ones do, of course they do, but where the trim actually takes pressure off the yoke and you feel it in there, but that's not something most of us will have in our homes. Is there anything you want to say more about your sim setup? I know you were pretty proud of it a while back.
I've got it in pieces right now because I'm upgrading to the G1000 sim setup. I guess you can see it, the 430 there. That was my demon that I had to face to learn that for my instrument flight test. So this sim was set up quite close to the configuration of the airplane that I did my flight test in. So it was an incredibly valuable tool talking about using a sim to replicate your real world training. Obviously the hand flying side was not useful. In fact, the airplane I did my flight test in did not have an autopilot, so I had to hand fly the whole thing in real life. But in the sim, I only used the autopilot because I got so frustrated trying to hand fly it, because it's so much harder to hand fly the sim than the real plane, which is ironic, but that's the way it is. So I was using mostly the autopilot in this thing, and running through my flight test routine and programming the 430 and doing all that stuff. And it was super helpful to learn that. And the next thing I'm going to do is go get I have my multi-engine rating VFR only. So I'm going to go get my multi-IFR in a DA42 with the G1000. So I'm going to upgrade my home sim here to match that configuration and learn that. So that's kind of my next plan. We were kind of in that process when all this stuff went down. So that all kind of paused. So my sim is a little bit messed up here as I have it decombobulated, but I might recombobulate it to do some more flying with the way it is now.
Okay. Well, Steve, I know you're busy. You've been doing live streams, I believe, on Instagram with AOPA off and on all day long. I know you're busy.
Yeah, they gave me the feed
so
today, yeah.
Thanks. I really do appreciate you taking the time out today. I know it was tough. We're going to see you again on Friday. So
right.
Have a fun day. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be talking on Friday.
All right.
Okay, so we've got one more guest today, and he's a special friend, but let me just kind of summarize something that we said earlier in this discussion, talking about using simulator hardware and hand flying and using the trim wheel. This is a simulator is a good time to get this concept in your head that pitch plus power equals performance. You can configure the airplane based on a certain pitch attitude, a certain power setting, and under a given set of weather conditions and other circumstances, altitude, you are going to get a constant fixed set of circumstances, an outcome. So pitch plus power equals performance. Learn these pitch and power settings for descents, straight and level, climbs, and in a sim, that's a good place to practice that. Our next guest is an old friend of ours, been doing these things off and on with him for a couple of years, Mr. Rod Machado from beautiful San Clemente. Good afternoon, Rod.
Russell. Good afternoon, Russell.
Good afternoon to you too. We are going to talk about simulators, and we picked you because you have a unique situation. People who've been using Flight Sim, Microsoft Flight Sim, might recognize this, but other people may not know that you were the virtual flight instructor in that product. And I know you took it over from another famous aviator prior to you. That's kind of a funny story. I'd like to hear about it.
You bet. First of all, kudos to you for putting this on for people that are stuck at home during the zombie apocalypse here. And that's a very nice thing for you to do. And it's a great service to the aviation community. And something else to consider here too. I was just thinking about this. You know, there was a time if you threw a roll of toilet paper from an airplane, the FAA would consider that a public nuisance. Now it's considered a public service. So the times change, and so many things change. The world is not the same as it was 2 or 3 weeks ago. But I had the great pleasure of being able to participate in Microsoft Flight Sim. And at about, I'd say, the turn of the century, I always wanted to say that while I was still alive, the turn of the century, early, maybe 2004 or something like that, I had been playing with Microsoft Flight Simulator over the years. I've always been a very, very big simulator fan. And actually, I'll tell you about this in a second. I was using flight simulators back in 1976, 77. Not Microsoft Flight Simulator, but another version. And then, of course, when Microsoft Flight Simulator came out, and I remember the 1995 version, and it was basically stick figure simulator. And it was pretty basic. And let's see. I was thinking, if you were to walk into one of the famous caves in France, Glasgow as an example, where they have stick figures on the wall, you'd see a bison, and then you'd see let's say a horse, and right next to it, you could see the early version of Microsoft Flight Simulator. That's how basic it was. But then it evolved. And it turned out that Chuck Yeager was one of the instructors or the instructor on Microsoft Flight Sim, and he would offer general comments from his perspective about how people were flying. And I thought it was funny. The jet, they're pretty calm. Sometimes he could be kind of intimidating. I remember one time I heard something like, and it's been so long, I don't know exact verbiage. He would say something like, well, Bart, it's clear that you're not ready to fly, so I suggest you stop flying altogether. Get into an avocation that doesn't involve something with wings. And so he could be kind of intimidating sometimes. So I said to Bruce Williams, I said, hey, listen, why don't you have somebody else there that might be a little less intimidating? And Bruce said, well, who'd you have in mind? And I said, me. So I'd love to do that. That would be so much fun. And so I got involved doing that, and I wrote the lessons and narrated the lessons as best I possibly could for the simulator. And I think the important point there is that I wrote those lessons and narrated them as best I could to replicate exactly what I would do in a real airplane. So there's a tremendous benefit from going through those lessons, practicing and doing exactly what I say in the simulator. And remember, it's a simulator, so not everybody has a hat switch on their joystick, and they can't look outside right or left, which, by the way, is a great thing to have. hat switch on a joystick, because that really does bring a great deal of realism into the simulator. So the lessons are very effective for helping people learn about the basics of aviation. And so I was very happy to participate in that.
Okay, excellent. And in just a second, we're going to take a look at a video that shows you in action in the simulator. But I wanted to take an opportunity here. Let's put up a copy of your website and your YouTube channel so that people can see how to keep up with you, how to contact you, and see what you're doing. So you've got your website is rodmachado.com, I believe. And there it is.
That's correct.
Lots of stuff at Rod's Learning Center. He's a competitor, but we let him on here anyway. He's a nice competitor. And he's also got a very active YouTube channel. I'd like to think I am. So he's got a good YouTube channel. Go visit there and see a lot of his stuff. It's worthwhile, and you'll get a lot of the material even out of his paid products. You'll see occasionally show up in his YouTube videos. So it's definitely worth taking a look at. So let's, Rod, pop up this video that we have. I believe, going through it, I recall that there's no narration in the first part of it, but in the rest of it, you have it narrated. So we'll run it, and you talk or not talk as appropriate. Does that work?
Okay, that's what. Run it, and let's see what video we have on it, Russ.
Okay, let's see it.
And this is how to find Microsoft Flight Sim. It's in the lessons section. These are the lessons, and click the basic one. Go through all the basic material first. And this is very, very important, so that if this is an ab initio introduction to you, that you'll know what to expect in the actual lesson. And then when you're ready to fly, you click ready to fly.
Indicator. That's the one right below the attitude indicator with all the numbers on it. It looks like a roulette wheel with an airplane in the middle. See how it shows W at the top of the dial? That means we're on a heading of west, or 270 degrees. We call it 270 because we get paid by the syllable, and that's the way it's said in aviation. And we should check for traffic before we turn. No, I don't mean automobile traffic either. There are no cars up here. I'm speaking specifically of airplane traffic. We don't want to run into another simulator up here on this lesson. As we approach our desired heading, we start to roll the wings level and release the back pressure we've been holding. We have to start a rollout before we get to the heading, or else we'll shoot past it and have to turn back, and all the birds will laugh at
us. That's great.
And that's
and it's
just
pretty cool that people can buy.
Yeah, that's just one example, Russ. I just took sections out of that, several different lessons, or I'm sorry, the straight and level lesson. Straight and level, by the way, is actually one maneuver for those students. It's not two separate maneuvers. So, and also I try to make a little bit of fun for people. My gosh, aviation can be very intimidating. You know how it is. You walk into a cockpit, look at that, and you say, boy, you can sure tell what time it is with all these clocks in here, as the old saying goes. So I meant it to be fun, and it is very instructional. And there are some things that I want to mention about this type of simulation device. First of all, I'm a big Microsoft Flight Simulator fan. The calculus of, let's say, the bang for the buck, what you get for what you would invest in Microsoft Flight Simulator with your traditional average desktop computer, and the benefit of it in terms of the acquisition of flying skills. That's a very, very good ratio. And for acquiring the hardware that you might use on Microsoft Flight Simulator, you can buy it retail, but my advice is go to eBay and see if you can get a good deal on used equipment. And you can get some fantastic deals that way. Joystick, if you can use rudders or acquire rudders, that's fantastic. And I'm a big believer in using Microsoft Flight Sim for basic primary training. And by the way, X-Plane, wonderful simulator too. So let's just call it a flight simulation device or desktop flight simulator for basic training. And the people, I think the most common response from people is, well, no, wait a minute. I don't believe in using any type of desktop simulation because they don't replicate the flight of a real airplane. They don't feel like a real airplane. Well, as I tell everybody when we talk about these things in seminars, I have flown real airplanes that don't fly like real airplanes. what Microsoft or what any good desktop simulator does is it allows you to develop very basic habit patterns that directly transfer to the cockpit. And I realize that sometimes the feel may vary depending on the joystick, and some joysticks just don't bring you much joy. Like the kind that you pay maybe $1 for, but you know you can get a reasonably good joystick for about $30 or so on eBay, and maybe a Microsoft Force Feedback joystick, which is an excellent one, and they're still around. So the idea, though, and the value in using Microsoft Flight Simulator in this instance is, I think, held in the macro perspective in terms of how you. Steve talked about the macro perspective, and that's very valuable. But the micro perspective is also very, very unique too. Let me give you an example. If you were to acquire a black belt in martial arts, you would have to spend roughly, let's say, 3 years and 1,000 hours of practice to get an honestly earned black belt. And you would also learn to say many frightening Japanese words too, like hiya, which in Japanese means ouch. But you would actually acquire those skills, 1,000 hours of practice, you would acquire enough skill to be able to acquire a black belt. Now think about this. Out of all those skills that you practice, I would say 75 to 80% of those skills are basically repetitive exercises. It's the punching, it's the kicking, single step applications of blocks and things like that. And 75 to 85% of all the that you do in acquiring a black belt. And that is what we call the micro perspective. But in a simulator, we're far more interested sometimes in going on cross-country flights, doing steep turns, and those are great things to do. But from the micro perspective, you would find tremendous value in a flight simulator by doing, for example, putting the aircraft on a half-mile final at roughly 500 feet above the ground, aligned with the runway, with a slight, let's say, the addition of turbulence set into the simulator. And your objective at a half-mile final, 500 feet, is, and that's, let's say, the typical 1.3 glide speed, let's say 65 miles per 50. Fly, glide down to the runway, doing nothing, banking with the straight with the rudder. In other words, if the airplane is banked to the left or right, you level the wings and apply rudder to compensate for adverse yaw. You do that all the way down to the runway, because one of the big problems with people learning to land is just trying to keep the airplane lined up, the sight picture lined up, so then a student can anticipate when the runway is going to start to visually expand, and then thus they would respond with the flare. They can anticipate their height above the ground and so many other things that they need to anticipate. So that exercise, you have that set in the flight sim, and then when you're done, you can take it down to landing if you want, but you don't have to. Click the control colon button, go back, restart, and fly the same thing over and over again. In other words, practice does not make perfect, but practice does make permanent. That is such a valuable habit to acquire. Another one is rolling into a turn. We don't necessarily want to look at the turn coordinator, when, in other words, the inclinometer, when we're rolling into a turn. So with rudders and aileron, when you roll into a turn, you can roll into a turn right and left, and your objective is to apply sufficient rudder to compensate for the adverse yaw by looking directly over the nose. So you practice rolling right, rolling left, rolling into a turn for 20 or 30 degrees, rolling to another turn, opposite direction, and the objective there is to be able to get good at knowing how much rudder to apply based on the visual response you see over the nose. That again is the macro perspective. I've got to tell you, that if you practice those things, I'll give you one more for instrument training too, if you don't mind. How do you know how fast to turn when that localizer needle starts moving in as you're being vectored onto the localizer? Well, if you're like me, and I know I am, I couldn't resist, Russ. If you're like me, and I know I am, when that needle starts to move in, and by the way, I'll tell you, the only needle that, as an instrument student, that I could keep centered during instrument training was the amp beater needle, and as long as the strobes weren't on. So that is rather difficult initially to do. But if you practice that on Microsoft Flight Sim or X-Plane, have set up for an intercept angle to the localizer, and you can try different intercept angles, but that's just a module that you set up, and you go back and practice over and over again, getting used to anticipating the rate of needle movement with the degree of turn that you need. What a wonderful exercise. And there are so many exercises like that. I have an article on my website called Defeated by Defeat, D-A-F-E-E-T. And that's also on YouTube. So go into YouTube, type in Rod Machado, and you'll get one of three things. Either 1,000 jiu-jitsu guys, one guy who surfs, or me. Look at my videos and you'll find several videos there on how to land, for example, but there's one called Defeated by Defeat, and it's a great video to look at, and I show one of those exercises in there. So having been instructing in simulators since 1976, and I've developed a deep appreciation for the value of these things from the micro perspective, not the macro. The micro. Macro's great, don't get me wrong. Micro is kind of like where I like to specialize with this, because this is how you accelerate the acquisition of behaviors with a student. And this is why I think in many cases we don't use simulators to their full effectiveness. And this is how you do it. And actually, back in 1976, I was using something called an ATC 610 desktop simulator. And this was a fascinating thing. It weighed about 60 pounds. You put it on a desktop and you plug the thing in, and it was insanely great. I love the thing. It was, this didn't have any visual presentation, just instruments. And this allowed you to develop some great instrument skills. I had one student one time when we were practicing. I was thinking back then, how can I use this as a VFR simulation platform? We were practicing stalls, and the simulator was set pretty close to the edge of the table. He was in his chair, and when the light came on in the simulator, the stall light, because we would slow it down, get ready for the stall, the light came on. He got a little too excited, and he goes, "Stall!" shoves the control forward, and the whole simulator just went right off the desk. Boom! Now, that wouldn't have been so bad, but he was sitting in his chair, and he held on as it went over the precipice. And it drug him up onto the table, and I'm looking, I'm going, oh no. I have experienced the first student to ever successfully crash a simulator. But he's holding on, and I'm thinking, well, at least he's got that going for him. And it was, it was the most strange thing. But, you know, we had so much fun doing these things. And I'm going to tell you one more story about flight sim, if I may. Some people say, well, you know, you develop very bad habits from flight simulator that carry into the airplane. Well, Captain Ed Valdez, an instructor at Cerritos College, has acquired an enormous amount of empirical evidence on the ultimate value of flight simulator in his classes that he teaches there. In fact, so much so, using Microsoft Flight Sim and some pretty sexy and sophisticated video panels or TV sets, or the screens used to simulate looking outside. He was able to, well, I'll give you an example. One student took his entire semester class. The student had never flown an airplane before, never been in one. Went over to Long Beach Airport, asked to take a demo flight, and then did this. He said to the instructor, listen, what I'd like to do is do everything. Please, you know, take over when necessary, but please do everything to the extent that you can allow me to do this. And the instructor only had to touch the controls once, and that wasn't even during the landing, by the way. And this is what the student told me. I wrote about this in several articles that you can find in my blog area on my website. It's just a powerful testament to the uniqueness of a flight simulator. And my favorite simulator story is I took a student from Long Beach City College one time. He had spent an entire semester doing his training, instrument training, sitting at the ATC 610 with a student instructor next to him simulating the part of air traffic control. And then Marty was my student. He would fly the airplane, and the student air traffic control over here on the side would tell him what to do. So Marty would take off and call air traffic control. You know how that drill works. So it was Marty graduated from the college semester system. He came over to the airport at Long Beach where I was instructing, and he said, I'd like to start instrument training. That's fine. So we start him right off with calling air traffic control, climbing out, VFR on top. And so we did that. We get in the airplane. I told Marty what to do, and we're climbing out. And I said, Marty, contact coast approach. So Marty does this. He doesn't key the mic button. He just yells out, coast approach. This is 2132 Bravo climbing to 4,000 feet. And I realized he didn't key the mic button. So I look over and I go, this is coast approach. We could hear you if you open that little window and yell outside. And so that was an example of negative transfer, but it's one of the very few examples of negative transfer I've experienced with people using simulators when they're taught properly in the simulator.
Gotcha. And I remember the ATC 610. I've got some time behind those two. Big old beast of a thing too, as I recall. And you know, if you had this issue with the guy going right over the front of it, I think you had to adjust those seat rails, little stops like you're supposed to put on your Cessna. That's probably what happened. You didn't have those things fixed. I do remember, Rod, your video, Defeated by Defeat. I would suggest everybody take a look at that. We're going to go ahead and wrap it up today. This has been a fun sim day, and it was great to put together our Sun and Fun replacement. Tomorrow, Rod's going to be back with us, along with David St. George. David's going to be talking about his ferry flight in that RV-10 from Oregon back to New York, and this is going to be really fun. It was quite an adventure. Let's see, we've got Greg Brown on the list there. Greg is, yes, I got the old list. We've got Greg Brown to talk about photography tomorrow. It's going to be wonderful. If you've ever seen any of his work, he does beautiful work, and he's going to talk about some of the tricks he does to pick the right shots and what he does to make them look good, because he's shooting through plexiglass, but you can't tell it. So tomorrow, come back for Wings Up Week, day 3, 3 p.m. Eastern, same time as now. I want to thank everybody who was with us today. Paul, Chris, Mr. Chops, and Mr. Machado. Tomorrow at 3, we'll see everyone, and remember to fly smart and show everyone that you're a Gold Seal pilot. So long.
This webinar is brought to you by SAFE and the Gold Seal Online Ground School, where instructors join for free. Visit Gold Seal at onlinegroundschool.com.